In 1893, two companies submitted bids to light the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. General Electric, backed by Thomas Edison, wanted $1.72 million to install a direct current system. Westinghouse Electric, founded by George Westinghouse in Pittsburgh 7 years earlier, came in at $399,000 using alternating current. That single envelope changed the trajectory of American electricity. The man behind that bid was George Westinghouse, a Pittsburgh industrialist who had already made his fortune from the railroad air brake. 5 years earlier, he'd struck a deal with a Serbian immigrant named Nikola Tesla. $25,000 in cash, $50,000 in notes, and a royalty of $2.50 for every horsepower of AC capacity sold. It was, by any measure, a bet on an unproven technology that most of the electrical establishment considered dangerous. Westinghouse had already put a practical face on that technology with the help of an engineer named William Stanley Jr., who developed the first viable AC transformer for the company in 1886, the piece that made long-distance power transmission actually workable. But Chicago proved them wrong. Roughly 92,000 incandescent lamps lit the fairgrounds that summer, and for the first time, millions of Americans saw what alternating current could actually do. Within 2 years, Westinghouse built the generators for the Adams Power Plant at Niagara Falls, and on November 16, 1896, AC electricity reached the city of Buffalo 26 miles away. The world's first large-scale hydroelectric station belonged to Westinghouse. By 1900, the company employed around 50,000 people across more than 60 affiliated businesses. George Westinghouse himself held 361 patents by the time he died in 1914, and the brand he left behind would go on to touch nearly every corner of American life, from the kitchen to the battlefield to the atom itself. After George Westinghouse died, the company he left behind did something remarkable. It kept reinventing itself. A Westinghouse engineer named Frank Conrad rigged up a transmitter on the factory roof in East Pittsburgh and started broadcasting music and election results to anyone with a homemade receiver. That little experiment became KDKA, the first commercially licensed radio station in the United States, and suddenly, a company known for turbines and transformers was shaping how Americans consumed information. From there, Westinghouse pushed into the American home with a kind of restless ambition that's hard to imagine from a single company today. Washing machines, refrigerators, ovens, and in 1954, one of the first color televisions you could actually buy, at a price that would cost you roughly $15,000 in today's money. It reached a point where it was hard to walk through an American household without touching something that had the Westinghouse name on it. And then the company made what might be its most audacious leap. In the late 1950s, Westinghouse designed and built the Shippingport Atomic Power Station in Pennsylvania, the world's first full-scale civilian nuclear plant. The reactor was designed by Westinghouse Electric in cooperation with the Division of Naval Reactors under Admiral Hyman Rickover, the same man who had built the propulsion systems for the first nuclear submarines. That lineage mattered. It meant the civilian program inherited decades of military-grade engineering discipline. The whole effort was made politically possible by President Eisenhower's 1953 Atoms for Peace speech, which directed American nuclear expertise toward civilian power, rather than weapons alone. A company that had started with railroad brakes was now splitting atoms to keep the lights on. That's not a normal corporate trajectory. I think what gets lost when you tell this story in hindsight is just how deeply embedded Westinghouse was in everyday American life. By the 60s, the company had swelled into a conglomerate of roughly 135 divisions, with over 100,000 employees building everything from radar systems to nuclear fuel rods to the refrigerator in your grandmother's kitchen. It was everywhere, which made what happened next all the more difficult to watch. The trouble started, ironically, with the thing Westinghouse did best. In the early 70s, the company had been selling nuclear reactors bundled with a promise: fixed-price uranium contracts that guaranteed utilities cheap fuel for years. It was a brilliant sales pitch right up until uranium prices exploded by 400% in the mid-70s. Suddenly, Westinghouse owed more uranium than it could afford to buy, and 27 utilities came after them in court. The settlements cost nearly $1 billion, and the company's reputation as a reliable partner took a hit it never fully recovered from. But here's what really killed Westinghouse, and it had nothing to do with power plants. During the 80s, the company quietly built up a financial services arm called the Westinghouse Credit Corporation. It was essentially a bank hiding inside a manufacturing company, lending aggressively into commercial real estate while nobody outside the boardroom paid much attention. When the real estate market collapsed in the early 90s, that division alone posted a $1.6 billion loss in a single quarter. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire company had spent building America's first nuclear power plant, gone in 90 days. By 1993, Westinghouse was drowning in over $5 billion of debt, and the board brought in a new CEO named Michael Jordan. Not the basketball player, a former PepsiCo executive who looked at this wounded industrial giant and saw something nobody expected. He saw a television network. In 1995, Jordan announced that Westinghouse would acquire CBS for $5.4 billion. A company that had lit the Chicago World's Fair, built the generators at Niagara Falls, and designed the first civilian nuclear reactor was now buying a TV network. And, to pay for it, Jordan started dismantling everything that had made the company what it was. The Defense Electronics division went to Northrop Grumman. The power generation business went to Siemens. And on December 1, 1997, Westinghouse Electric Corporation officially changed its name to CBS Corporation. I find it hard to think of another moment in American corporate history where a company this significant simply chose to stop being itself. It wasn't a bankruptcy, it wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a deliberate decision to erase 111 years of industrial identity and replace it with a broadcasting logo. The nuclear division was the last piece left, and CBS sold it off to British Nuclear Fuels in 1999. But this is where the story splits in a way that most people don't realize. Because after the dust settled, there were suddenly two completely different companies walking around with the Westinghouse name, and they had nothing to do with each other. The nuclear side survived as Westinghouse Electric Company, a standalone business that kept designing reactors and fuel assemblies. Toshiba bought it in 2006 for $5.4 billion, betting big on a global nuclear renaissance. That bet went sideways. Two flagship AP 1000 reactor projects in the American South, Vaughtle in Georgia and VC Summer in South Carolina, ran so far over budget that Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy in 2017. One project was abandoned entirely. The other eventually came online, but at more than double the original cost estimate. Brookfield and the Canadian uranium company Cameco pulled the nuclear business out of bankruptcy, and today it's actually thriving. It recently landed an $80 billion framework deal with the U.S. government to build new reactors. That's a real company with real engineers doing real work. But that's not the Westinghouse most people encounter. When CBS rebranded itself in the late 90s, it held on to the Westinghouse trademark and created a licensing corporation, basically a legal entity whose only job was to rent out the name. Anyone willing to pay a royalty fee could slap the Westinghouse logo onto their product. And for a while, this arrangement lived quietly in the background, collecting modest checks while the name appeared on light bulbs, ceiling fans, and small appliances. Then, in 2021, Viacom CBS sold the entire trademark licensing operation to a private holding company run by a man named James Klein Jr. And that's when things got interesting. Klein's company, which almost absurdly is also called Westinghouse Electric Corporation, doesn't manufacture anything in the traditional sense. It licenses the name. And the most visible licensee for the product that probably brought you to this video is a Chinese company called Tongfang, a subsidiary of Tsinghua Tongfang, which is linked to Tsinghua University, one of China's most prestigious technical institutions, and partially owned by the Chinese state. They make the Westinghouse televisions you'll find at Walmart and Target and Best Buy. Search for Westinghouse on any of those websites and you'll find dozens of products, TVs, air fryers, generators, portable power stations, and virtually none of them are manufactured in the United States. There's something almost poetic about this, and I don't mean that as a compliment. The same logo that Paul Rand designed in 1960, that clean, iconic circle W, once appeared on the control panels of nuclear reactors and the dashboards of Cold War radar systems. Today, that identical logo sits on a $79 television made in Guangdong Province, sold by a company that exists primarily as a royalty collection vehicle. And the strange thing is, it's not illegal. It's not even particularly unusual. Brand licensing is a well-established business model. Polaroid, Kodak, RCA, plenty of once great American names have gone down a similar path. The brand outlives the company, becomes a ghost of itself, and ends up stamped onto whatever product can carry the price point. But Westinghouse hits different. This wasn't a company that made cameras or film. This was the company that electrified America and brought civilian nuclear power into existence. The distance between what that name once meant and what it means now, a sticker on an imported appliance, is maybe the starkest example of how American industrial identity can be hollowed out and resold. Next time you walk through the electronics aisle at Walmart and see a Westinghouse TV sitting on the shelf for $79, take a second to think about where that name came from. Think about a Pittsburgh factory in 1886, a handshake with Nikola Tesla, and a bid envelope that changed the way electricity works. Then, look at the fine print on the back of the box. The company that built all of that is gone. What's left is a trademark passed from CBS to Viacom to a private holding company in Ohio, rented out to manufacturers in Guangdong. The name survived. The thing behind the name didn't. And honestly, I'm not sure which version of that story is sadder.